Slave breeding farms were one of the most inhumane and horrific practices in the United States history of slavery. As the name implies, these farms were a place where slaves were forced to breed, often with little regard for their welfare or safety. These places of terror, which have been largely forgotten from our nation's history, were places of unimaginable suffering and horror for African American slaves. In this video, we will explore the truth behind slave breeding farms, the atrocities that occurred within them, and the lasting effects of this practice on modern society. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Join us on a thrilling journey as we explore the breathtaking wonders of our amazing planet. But before we embark on this extraordinary adventure, we kindly request you to take a moment to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Doing so ensures you won't miss any of our upcoming videos packed with awe-inspiring content. So, without further ado, let's dive into the captivating world that awaits us. The origins of slave breeding. The practice of slave breeding dates back to the early years of American slavery, with the buying and selling of enslaved people seen as a profitable business. However, it wasn't until the 19th century that slave breeding farms became widespread, particularly in the southern United States. Slave breeding farms were established to breed enslaved men and women, creating a system that treated human beings as nothing more than mere livestock. These farms were typically owned and operated by white plantation owners who viewed their enslaved population as property to be used and abused for their financial gain. While slavery was already an incredibly inhumane institution, the introduction of slave breeding farms took the horrors of slavery to a new level. Enslaved people were stripped of any semblance of agency over their bodies, with their fertility and reproductive capabilities closely monitored and exploited for the benefit of their owners. The establishment of these farms were not only a testament to the systemic racism of the time, but also to the greed and callousness of those who sought to profit from the sale of enslaved people and their offspring. The origins of slave breeding farms represent a dark and shameful period in American history, highlighting the lengths people were willing to go for the exploitation and abuse of others. The legacy of these farms has left a lasting impact on the Black community, and we must continue to educate ourselves and acknowledge the horrific truth of this chapter in American history. The business of slave breeding farms. Slave breeding was a lucrative industry in the American South that fueled the expansion of the slave system. Slave owners saw breeding as a means of creating a self-sustaining workforce and generating profit through the sale of offspring. This led to the establishment of slave breeding farms, where enslaved women were forcibly impregnated and forced to carry their pregnancies to term. The practice of slave breeding began in the early days of slavery when plantation owners would mate enslaved people to produce more workers for the plantation. As the demand for slave labor grew, so did the business of slave breeding farms. These farms were often run by wealthy landowners who hired overseers to manage the day-to-day operations. Enslaved women were the primary target for breeding, as their reproductive capacities were viewed as a valuable resource. They were forced to mate with selected male slaves or sometimes even the slave owner himself. Women were often subjected to multiple pregnancies, as slave owners believed that they could produce up to 2 or 3 children per year. Slave breeding farms were typically located on large plantations, where the enslaved women would be housed in cramped quarters and subjected to harsh working conditions. Women who were unable to conceive were often punished, either physically or emotionally, as they were viewed as unproductive. The babies born on these farms were considered property and were often sold at slave markets to other plantation owners. The business of slave breeding farms was highly profitable, as owners could generate a large profit from the sale of offspring. As a result, slave breeding was a significant driver of the slave trade in America and contributed to the growth of the institution of slavery. Conditions on slave breeding farms. Slave breeding farms were some of the most brutal and inhumane institutions that existed in America. Conditions were horrific and unimaginable, with no regard for the welfare of the slaves who were subjected to constant abuse and cruelty. These farms were created with one purpose in mind: to produce as many slaves as possible. Slaves on these farms were forced to mate with each other, sometimes as often as once a day, with no consideration for their well-being or their rights as human beings. Conditions on these farms were squalid, with slaves living in cramped and unsanitary conditions. They were fed poorly and had no access to medical care or basic hygiene. Many slaves died from diseases such as smallpox, dysentery, and tuberculosis, which spread easily in crowded living conditions. Slaves on breeding farms were also subjected to constant punishment and violence. They were whipped, beaten, and often chained up for hours on end. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation, as they were expected to breed as often as possible. It is important to understand that the goal of these farms was not only to increase the number of slaves, but also to increase the profits of slave owners. The more slaves they produced, the more they could sell them for. This created a ruthless system where slaves were treated as nothing more than commodities. The dehumanizing conditions on slave breeding farms were not lost on the slaves themselves. Many rebelled and resisted their captivity, with some even risking their lives to escape. Their bravery and perseverance in the face of such horror is a testament to the human spirit and serves as a reminder of the strength and resilience of the enslaved African people. Overall, slave breeding farms were a horrific reminder of the atrocities committed against African Americans during the period of slavery. They were a testament to the cruelty and inhumanity of the system of slavery, and the legacy of their existence continues to be felt today. We must remember this dark chapter of American history and work towards creating a more just and equitable society for all. Sexual violence and exploitation. One of the most horrific aspects of slave breeding farms was the rampant sexual violence and exploitation that occurred. Enslaved women, both young and old, were subjected to rape and forced breeding by their white masters or overseers. Many of these women were repeatedly impregnated and forced to give birth to children who would be sold off to other plantations. This was done solely to increase the profits of the plantation owners. Women on slave breeding farms had no control over their bodies and were treated as mere commodities. The men in charge saw them only as means to an end, and their bodies were used to profit. This practice dehumanized and degraded women, reducing them to nothing more than objects to be used and abused at the whim of their masters. These women faced additional abuse and violence when their children were taken from them, often at a very young age. Mothers would be forced to watch as their babies were ripped from their arms and sold off to another plantation, never to be seen again. The trauma and pain of this experience would have a lifelong impact on these women. It is important to recognize that the sexual violence and exploitation that occurred on slave breeding farms was not just a byproduct of the system, but an intentional and calculated strategy to increase profits. This horrific practice contributed to the overall dehumanization and mistreatment of enslaved people, and it is a legacy that continues to impact our society today. Resistance and rebellion. Despite the dehumanizing conditions of slave breeding farms, enslaved individuals were not passive victims. Instead, they fought back through various acts of resistance and rebellion. One of the most well-known examples of resistance on slave breeding farms was the Stono Rebellion in 1739. Enslaved Africans in South Carolina rose and attempted to flee to Spanish Florida, where they could live as free people. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed by local authorities, it served as a powerful symbol of resistance and sparked similar uprisings throughout the colonies. Other forms of resistance included sabotage, running away, and self-mutilation. Some enslaved women even resorted to contraception or abortion to prevent themselves from being forced to bear children on slave breeding farms. These acts of resistance were not only expressions of individual defiance, but also collective efforts to resist the dehumanization and violence of the slave system. They were also powerful political statements that challenged the legitimacy of slavery and demanded recognition of the humanity and dignity of enslaved people. Although these acts of resistance were often met with brutal repression, they inspired future generations of activists and revolutionaries in their fight against slavery and other forms of oppression. We must confront the horrifying truth behind slave breeding farms in America. These farms were part of a larger system of enslavement and oppression that was perpetuated for generations. The sexual violence and exploitation that took place on these farms cannot be overlooked or forgotten. The fact that humans were commodified and bred like animals is a stain on our nation's history and a reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of profit. It is our responsibility to continue to educate ourselves on the dark realities of slavery and ensure that we work toward a society where such exploitation is never allowed to happen again. That concludes our video. If you enjoyed it, we would appreciate your feedback by giving it a thumbs up. If you want to be among the first to know when we release a new video, make sure to enable notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming videos.